Welcome, the anointed ones. When truth becomes a threat, lies become law. Chosen ones, you weren't lied on by accident. It was a strategic defense mechanism. You didn't just scare them with your presence, you exposed them by existing. Think about this. Psychologists say people lie most often to protect one thing, their image. Not their soul, not their conscience. Just the cardboard cutout they want the world to clap for. And you? You were the glitch in their performance. The silent truth standing too tall next to their rented confidence. So, what did they do? They grabbed the mic, rewrote your story, and turned you into the villain of a drama you didn't audition for. It's wild how the same folks who couldn't spell integrity somehow became the narrators of your life story. But here's where it gets even messier, and funnier if we're being brutally honest. They lied about you so hard you almost wanted to meet the person they described just out of curiosity. Who is this chaotic, manipulative, power-hungry mastermind with Jedi mind tricks and no empathy? Because surely it's not you, the one out here just trying to heal, keep your peace, and drink your tea in silence. Nah, that character? That was their only chance at saving face. Because if people ever knew the truth about how much you survived with your soul still intact, they'd start questioning why these so-called powerful people were so obsessed with destroying someone they claimed was irrelevant. Today, we're going to expose it. Not just what they said about you, but why they had to say it. Buckle up, because once you see what really happened, you'll never doubt your power again. Number 1. Your existence disproves their entire identity. They lied about you because your very existence blew a hole in the story they built their identity on. These people depended on looking like the smartest, the strongest, the most in control. Their whole image was a performance. They wore power like a costume, and most people clapped for it. But you didn't clap. You didn't bend. You didn't even react the way they expected. That's what shook them. You never had to raise your voice or seek attention. Your energy alone said, "I see through you," and that terrified them. They built their worth on having others under their thumb. They needed to be the loudest voice in the room, the one people turned to, the one people feared. But when you walked in, suddenly the room didn't revolve around them anymore. And that's when they knew. You were different. You weren't competing with them, but you were outshining them without trying. You weren't chasing validation, but people started noticing you anyway. That was the real threat. You weren't trying to prove anything, but your authenticity exposed their performance for what it was, empty. That's when they decided you needed to be discredited. Not because you were a problem, but because the truth about you would show how powerless they really are. If people saw how strong, grounded, and real you were, they'd stop seeing these manipulators as the authority. They'd start questioning the lies, the favoritism, the fake personas. They'd realize these people only had power because others gave it to them. And worse, they'd stop giving it. That's what made you dangerous. So they twisted the story, made you out to be unstable, rebellious, arrogant, too sensitive, too much. But the truth? You were the proof that power doesn't need to scream. It just needs to stand, and you stood. That's why they lied, because the truth would have broken the illusion, and the illusion is the only thing they ever really had. Number 2. They didn't just fear you, they feared what you'd wake up in others. They didn't just lie about you because they feared you. They lied because they feared what you would awaken in other people. Your presence was like a signal, subtle but loud enough to rattle everything fake around you. You didn't beg for followers, you didn't need a stage. But people felt something when you entered the room. Not because you were trying to be anything special, but because you carried a truth that couldn't be denied. And truth, when it's alive in someone, is contagious. You didn't preach at people, but your life quietly challenged them. It made them question things they were taught to accept. It made them uncomfortable with the lies they'd been living in. That's what made you dangerous. You weren't just a person to be silenced. You were a spark that could start a fire. So they got ahead of it. They told people you were fake. They called you too intense, too spiritual, too rebellious, too out there. They slapped labels on you like warnings, hoping others would turn away before they felt what was real in you. Because the truth is, once people start waking up, they don't go back to sleep. They stop playing the game. They stop idolizing the wrong people. They start asking questions, and worst of all, they start remembering who they are. That's the last thing these power-hungry people want. They built entire systems on fear and manipulation. Your light disrupted all that. You reminded people of their power just by being yourself. So the lies weren't just to isolate you, they were damage control. You were the quiet revolution they saw coming. Not because you had a loud voice, but because you had an undeniable presence. One that couldn't be controlled, predicted, or used. You woke people up just by being alive in a world full of people pretending to be. And once they realized that, they knew they had to bury your name before the truth started spreading. Number 3. They had to rewrite your narrative because they couldn't rewrite their karma. They couldn't undo what they did to you, so they did the next best thing. They rewrote the story. They lied because the truth was too heavy for them to carry. If people ever knew what really went down, the spotlight would shift, and they'd have to answer questions they've spent their whole lives avoiding. So they flipped the script. They made themselves the victim and painted you as the problem, because owning up to what they did would have required a level of honesty they never developed. They had to spin a new version of reality where they were justified, where you somehow deserved what happened, or where they tried their best, but you were just too much to handle. Because if they didn't, they'd have to sit with their guilt. And people like this don't self-reflect, they self-defend. They had to cover their tracks, not just to protect their image, but to avoid dealing with the fact that they crossed lines they had no business crossing. The lies weren't just about you, they were about their own shame. You were the walking proof of what they did wrong. That's why you made them uncomfortable, even in silence. You reminded them of their betrayal, their cruelty, their manipulation, their cowardice. And since they couldn't fix the past, they tried to bury it. They thought if they told the story often enough, loud enough, and to the right people, it would erase the truth. But it didn't. Deep down, they still know. And that's the part that eats them alive. They didn't want justice. They wanted escape. They didn't want to make peace. They wanted distance from the facts, from the consequences, and especially from you. Because standing next to you with your dignity still intact, your heart still beating, and your spirit still alive, it reminds them that no matter how much they lied, they lost. Not because the lie wasn't convincing, but because the truth never really went anywhere. It's just been waiting. Number 4. They called you crazy, so no one would listen when you started making sense. They called you crazy not because you were unstable, but because you were awake, more awake than they wanted anyone to be. Your clarity threatened their control. When you started making sense in a world full of noise and deception, they panicked. It's easier for them to label you as off balance or delusional than to confront the uncomfortable truths you exposed. That label wasn't about your mind. It was a weapon designed to silence you and keep their schemes running smoothly. You weren't losing it. You were tuned in to realities they worked hard to hide. They feared what you saw and understood because it made their lies obvious to everyone else. By painting you as crazy, they tried to isolate you, to turn people against you, and to make your voice disappear beneath the buzz of doubt they created. When those in power scream crazy loud enough, society often chooses to believe them because it's easier to dismiss the messenger than to face the message. It's a classic move. Protect the liar by discrediting the truth-teller. They needed the world to stop listening when you spoke, so their thefts, their manipulations, and their cover-ups could continue unnoticed. The sad irony is that when the sane are called insane, the real danger is not you. It's the liars who keep their grip by gaslighting entire communities. But you weren't crazy. You were the clear signal cutting through their static noise. They just didn't want anyone else to hear it. And the moment people start listening to the one they labeled crazy, that's when their house of cards begins to crumble. Number 5. You were the proof. They never had real power, only permission. You didn't bow down. You didn't play their game. You stood your ground when everyone else folded, and that was the problem for them. Because their power wasn't built on strength or respect. It was built on people's silence and obedience. The moment you refused to obey, refused to break, refused to kiss their ring, you shattered the whole illusion they'd spent years constructing. You became the living proof that their so-called power was nothing more than a house of cards, balanced on fear and the willingness of others to stay trapped beneath it. They thrived because people forgot one crucial thing. Power isn't given by those who hold the crown. It's granted by those who choose to follow. Without your submission, their control falls apart. When you decided you wouldn't play by their rules or live in their shadow, you stripped them of the permission they relied on. That's why they lied about you, smeared you, and tried to erase you. Not because they feared your strength, but because they feared what happened when others saw that their king was actually just a man in a suit with no real kingdom. You exposed the fundamental truth they don't want anyone to face. Their dominance only exists as long as people accept it. You were the reminder that power belongs to the one who refuses to give it away. And by standing tall, unbroken, and unbought, you forced the world to see the emperor has no clothes. That's why they hated you, not because you were dangerous, but because you were free. Number 6. They painted you as the villain to avoid being seen as the predator. They didn't just lie about you to protect themselves, they twisted the whole story to hide their own guilt. By painting you as the villain, they made sure no one would look too closely at what they really were. Predators hiding behind masks of respectability. If the truth came out, people would have to face the ugly reality they'd been ignoring, the abuse they tolerated, the corruption they enabled, and the lies they chose to believe to keep their world comfortable. It's easier to believe you're the problem than to admit they've been protecting a wolf dressed up in leadership's clothing. So they flipped the script. They shoved the blame onto you, labeled you dangerous, reckless, even evil, because that narrative kept the spotlight off their own failures and crimes. It's a classic defense mechanism. Make the victim look like the threat, so no one dares to question the person actually holding the power. By demonizing you, they built a wall around themselves, keeping the truth locked out. They banked on people being too scared or confused to see through the smoke and mirrors, and for a while it worked. But no lie can hold forever. The longer the predator hides behind the mask, the more obvious it becomes, and the louder the truth you represent grows. They hoped the world would buy the story, that your voice would be drowned out by the fear and doubt they manufactured. But deep down, they knew the real danger wasn't you. It was their own reflection in the mirror. And that's why they were so desperate to silence you. Because you were the one who could make everyone else see what they never wanted to admit. The predator was never far from home. Number 7. You had to be lied about because you were the only one who couldn't be owned. They had to lie about you because you were the one person they couldn't control. Where others bent, broke, or played along, you stayed unshaken. No bribe was big enough, no manipulation clever enough, no shame sharp enough to make you bow down. You stood on your own ground, and that terrified them more than anything else. Because power in their world isn't about strength, it's about control. And you were proof that control could be resisted. Since they couldn't own you, they tried to erase your credibility instead. If they couldn't silence you by breaking you, they'd do it by turning everyone else against you. Labeling you as unreliable, unstable, or out of touch became their weapon. They wanted the world to doubt you so they could keep their grip on the narrative. Independence, in their eyes, wasn't freedom, it was a threat. Spiritual sovereignty wasn't enlightenment, it was rebellion. Your refusal to be owned shattered their whole system. You weren't just a free spirit, you were a disruptor, a constant reminder that true power comes from within, not from puppeteering others. And that's why they needed the lies. Because if people started believing in your independence, if they saw you as unbreakable and unbuyable, then their carefully constructed empire would begin to crumble. You were the living contradiction to everything they wanted, a person who could not be bought, broken, or bowed. So they lied. Because the truth was that you were the one thing they could never own, and that made you their greatest fear. Number 8. You triggered their hidden shame, so they made you a scapegoat. You didn't just upset them. You triggered something deep and raw inside them, something they've buried so far down they barely admit it to themselves. It wasn't jealousy they felt when they looked at you. It was exposure. You reflected back to them the parts they refused to face, their own spiritual cowardice, their refusal to grow, and their fear of confronting their brokenness. That reflection was too much for them to handle, so instead of looking inward, they chose to lash out. Making you the scapegoat was their defense mechanism. It was easier to pin their failures, their fears, and their weaknesses onto you than to do the hard work of self-examination and healing. You became the villain in their stories, the reason everything went wrong, the excuse they needed to avoid accountability. It wasn't about who you really were. It was about what they couldn't bear to admit about themselves. By casting you as the problem, they shielded their fragile egos from the truth that they were the ones hiding behind masks of false strength. Your presence was a threat, not because of what you did, but because of what you made them realize about themselves. They feared the honesty you represented, the courage you embodied, and the growth you dared to pursue. So instead of changing, they created a narrative where you were the enemy, hoping everyone else would believe the lie. But deep down, the real pain was theirs. They couldn't heal, so they hurt you instead. And that's why you were made the scapegoat, to carry the shame they refused to carry themselves. Number 9. They didn't just lie about you, they had to or risk collapse. You weren't just a problem for them. You were a threat so massive, so undeniable, that their entire system depended on keeping you out of the light. Your integrity shook the foundations they'd built on lies and deception. It wasn't enough for them to whisper falsehoods here and there. They had to create an elaborate web of lies, because the moment your truth became visible, everything they'd been protecting started to unravel. You were the silent earthquake beneath their fragile house of cards, and every honest word you lived by was a tremor that could topple their empire. When people glimpsed your genuine character, they didn't just see you, they saw what those in power had been hiding. They saw the real cost of their corruption, the damage their lies caused, and the faces of those they'd betrayed. Lying about you wasn't simply an attack. It was a calculated strategy for survival. They knew that if the truth about you spread, their entire narrative would collapse. Their reputation, their authority, their control, it all depended on keeping you discredited and invisible. Your truth was nuclear, too powerful and too explosive for them to handle openly. So they weaponized falsehoods, rumors, and slander to keep the walls from shaking too hard. They needed to convince the world you were unreliable, unstable, or dangerous. Anything to distract from the fact that your honesty threatened their existence. They bet on fear and confusion to buy them time, hoping the damage wouldn't reach critical mass. But the truth has a way of surviving underground, until the moment it erupts. And when it does, there's no hiding from it. They lied because they had to, because if they didn't, their entire house of cards would come crashing down around them. And that's the power you hold. The power to expose their collapse simply by being who you are. Number 10. They couldn't handle the fact that you endured without becoming bitter. They were counting on you to crack, to crumble under the weight of what you endured. They expected bitterness to poison your heart, or failure to define your story. But you didn't give them that satisfaction. Instead, you rose again and again, not because life was easy, but because your spirit refused to be broken. Your endurance wasn't just survival. It was a quiet rebellion that exposed the weakness behind their lies. When you stayed whole, when you didn't sink into the bitterness they predicted, their carefully crafted narratives fell apart. The lies that were meant to diminish you looked small and desperate. The abuse they inflicted, meant to keep you controlled, suddenly appeared petty and weak in the light of your resilience. And your strength? It wasn't just human willpower. It seemed almost divine, a force that couldn't be touched or tainted. That's what terrified them the most, your ability to endure without becoming their reflection. You showed the world that pain doesn't have to destroy, that wounds don't have to harden into hatred. You were living proof that there's a power beyond their cruelty, a light they couldn't snuff out no matter how hard they tried. Their fear wasn't about what they did to you. It was about what you refused to become because of it. And that refusal, it was a threat far greater than any lie they told. Because you didn't just survive, you thrived. And that truth was more powerful than anything they could throw at you. Number 11. You were the mirror. They spent their lives avoiding. They spent years running from their own reflection, avoiding the parts of themselves they didn't want to see. Most people don't want to face their flaws, their mistakes, or the darkness they carry inside. But you became that mirror, the one they desperately tried to avoid. You didn't have to say a single word to expose their true selves. Your very presence forced them to confront what they'd buried deep down. That's what made you dangerous, not because you attacked them, but because you held up a reflection they hated. When they looked at you, they saw their own weaknesses, their own lies, their own cowardice staring back at them. And that's terrifying for anyone who spent a lifetime hiding behind masks and excuses. So instead of facing themselves, they turned their anger toward you. They projected all their shame, guilt, and fear onto you, hoping that by destroying your image, they could escape the reflection you showed them. But no amount of lies or attacks could erase the truth you revealed simply by being who you are. You didn't have to try to expose them. They revealed themselves by reacting to you. That's why they feared you. Because you held up a mirror they couldn't break, a truth they couldn't deny, and a reality they couldn't escape. You were the reflection they spent their lives avoiding, and that's why you were their greatest threat. Number 12. They lied about you publicly because they couldn't beat you privately. They tried everything they could when no one was watching. Whispers meant to wear you down, attempts to twist your words, efforts to isolate you from support, all designed to break you quietly. But you didn't crack. Every tactic they pulled behind closed doors failed because you held your ground. You were untouchable in the silence, unshaken by their shadow games. That's when they got desperate. When private attacks didn't work, they went public. They plastered lies about you everywhere because they knew that in open daylight, where everyone could see and judge, their only chance was to drown out your truth with noise. It wasn't about proving you guilty. It was about trying to make you seem guilty enough to keep people from listening to you. Public lies are the last weapon of those who can't win fairly. They hope to create doubt, confusion, and division, hoping the crowd would turn away from your real story. They counted on the chaos they created to hide their failure to touch you in private. But here's the brutal truth. They only lied because they lost. Every smear, every false accusation was a sign of their powerlessness, because if they truly could have beaten you quietly, they would have. Instead, they had to drag you into the spotlight with lies, hoping the glare would blind everyone to their defeat. Their public lies are a monument to their private failure, and that's a truth that no lie can ever erase. Number 13. Your grace made their abuse look even worse. You handled everything with a quiet strength they never expected. Instead of fighting fire with fire, you chose grace, not because it made you weak, but because it made their cruelty impossible to ignore. They wanted chaos, outrage, and an excuse to justify what they did. But you gave them none of that. You stayed calm, collected, and above their petty attacks. Their abuse, meant to break you, only looked worse against your peaceful resilience. When you refused to retaliate, refused to sink to their level, it exposed a stark contrast that spoke louder than any words ever could. People saw the harshness of their actions reflected in your calm endurance, and suddenly their narrative started to crumble. Your silence wasn't weakness. It was a spotlight. It made their lies louder, but it also made their guilt impossible to hide. The more you held your peace, the more questions people began to ask. Why didn't you fight back? Why did you stay so composed when they were so vicious? Your grace became a living contradiction to every accusation they threw your way, unraveling the story they tried to build, and that terrified them. Because in your silence, you weren't disappearing. You were exposing. Your refusal to play their game turned the tables and made their guilt louder than their lies. You showed the world that true strength isn't about destruction. It's about standing tall when everyone expects you to fall. That's why your grace made their abuse look even worse. Number 14. You didn't just survive the lie, you became the proof. The truth always outlives the storyline. You didn't just get through the lies, they didn't swallow you whole or keep you silent forever. Instead, you became living proof that no false story can hold up against the unstoppable force of truth. Lies have an expiration date. They decay over time, losing their power, their grip, and their ability to deceive. Truth doesn't politely knock on the door. It bursts in, shaking everything to its core. And when that happens, it doesn't just clear your name, it flips the entire narrative upside down. What they tried to bury, dismiss, and ridicule is now rising as the foundation others will build upon. The very things they laughed at or tried to erase are now at the center of attention, changing minds and opening eyes. You've become the undeniable evidence that the system doesn't reward honesty or integrity. It shields the cunning and the manipulative. That ugly truth, once hidden, is now shining in full light. This shift is more than just personal vindication. It's a reckoning for the whole system that tried to silence you. Your survival is a signal to everyone watching. Lies can be constructed, but they won't last forever. The real story isn't just about you. It's about exposing the protectors of deception and finally holding them accountable. The lights are on now, and nothing can go back to the way it was. You are the proof that truth outlives every false storyline. And in the end, that's what changes everything. The truth about you is more than a story. It's a revolution waiting to ignite. They lied, manipulated, and tried to erase you because they feared what your existence revealed about their own fragility. But every falsehood they spun, every shadow they cast, only sharpened the light you carry inside. You weren't just a target, you were the awakening. The unshakable proof that their power was never real, just a house built on fear and deception. Now, as the truth rises, it doesn't merely clear your name, it dismantles the very foundation of their control. You embody the unyielding strength of those who refuse to be owned, silenced, or diminished. Your resilience is a message louder than any lie. Truth doesn't just survive, it transforms. It redefines realities, rewrites histories, and restores what was stolen. So stand tall in that truth. Your journey isn't just about survival, it's about victory. The world is watching, the lies are crumbling, and your light is unstoppable. In the end, the truth about you won't just be heard, it will change everything. If this message resonates with you and you're ready to stand strong in your truth, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful insights that cut through the noise. Like this video. If it moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear this, and drop a comment below. Your voice matters, and we want to hear your story. Together we're building a community where truth wins and nothing can hold us back. God bless you.